took an introductory course in the fall of '63 in my sophomore year, and I just fell in love with it. I had no idea what geology was. I had signed up, I started off as a history major at Del Mar, and then I was taking a biology class, and my professor was so good. Well, so was my history professor, but he was even better. So I moved to biology, and then I took a marine biology course, and I loved it, so I switched to marine biology. And as a requisite for biology, I was told I had to take chemistry. And that was fine. I signed up for chemistry, and at registration someone said, "Oh my God, you have the German woman chemistry teacher who flunks out the most students." And I had had almost no chemistry at Ingleside High School. And I thought, I think I'll wait and take chemistry some other time. And I asked someone at registration, what's another science I could take where they have a really good teacher? Because that was one of the things I really liked, was to find out who the best teacher was and then go with that class. And so I asked someone, and they said, well, geology is supposed to have a good teacher. And I said, well, what is geology? I had never even heard the term at Ingleside High School. And this person said, well, geology is like studying rocks and fossils and things like that. And I went, oh, well, the one time that I got out of the flat land of the Gulf Coast, we went to Big Bend, and I was just fascinated with these rocks that sparkled and made mountains and things like that. And I thought, well, I'd like to know a little bit about rocks. So I signed up and went to the geology class. And Mr. Hugh Doney, he didn't have his PhD at the time, he was working on it, was our instructor. He used to walk into the classroom with a great big cigar in his mouth, put it down on the edge of the eraser board and turn around and start speaking to us. And from the first moment he started talking, I was in love with geology and what he was saying. That was my sophomore year, and I took this physical geology course. At the same time, I was taking, my marine geology or marine biology. The second semester, my last semester at Del Mar, I took historical geology and paleontology at the same time, and I was taking invertebrate zoology. Well, we got to phylum Vermes, we got to the worms in marine zoology, and there were thousands of different classifications of worms. And I was getting very bored with worms. And in paleontology, we covered worms in about 3 seconds. 5 seconds, it was like phylum Vermes, here's a worm trail, that's it. And I thought, well, this is real attractive. Well, at the end of the semester, my professor came to me, and he said, you are my best student in geology. And I said, well, great, And he said, is there any chance you would change your major to geology? And I said, I've changed my major twice already. I'm a little embarrassed about it. And he said, well, I have a $700 scholarship for my best geology student if you were a major. And I said, oh. I had been working 2 to 4 jobs all the way through college, through my first 2 years here at Del Mar, and also through high school. So it sounded very appealing to get the scholarship. So I said, okay, you've convinced me. I'll change my major. And I changed the major, and at that time we had our graduation for our associate degree, and they had us walk across the stage by order of the size of the scholarship. And the Janowski Scholarship, which was given by the Corpus Christi Geological Society, was the largest scholarship handed out at Del Mar. So I was the grand finale walking across the stage at Del Mar for my associate degree, and got my degree and got my scholarship certificate, and I was coming down off the stage, and my French teacher was at the bottom of the stairs. And you have to understand that I was taking 18 hours, and most of them lab courses, including French, and working, and trying to have a good time, going to hootenannies and things like that. And I never got to the French lab. I just didn't get there. I just barely got out of French class. And my French teacher, Professor Griffiths, was at the bottom of the steps when I came off the stage, and she said, "Miss Rice, I didn't know. I thought you were stupid." So I learned a little bit from that when I was teaching geology. I always tried to find out if somebody was really being dumb in my class, if it was because they were working hard in other areas or they really were goofing off. So she taught me a lot. I was able to take that scholarship to Colorado State University. I couldn't go to the University of Texas at Austin because even though Del Mar at that time was the highest rated junior college in the state, they would not accept a bunch of my credits. And if I went to Texas, where I was accepted, but if I went there, it would take me another year to graduate. And I only had the scholarship for 2 years. And so I applied to Colorado State University, and the reason I applied there was because I had family there, and I thought I could live more cheaply with my aunt. And I got accepted there, and Colorado State University accepted all the credits that I earned at Del Mar. So I was able to go to school there and finish the degree in 4 years. When I arrived at Colorado State, the major professor, the chairman of our department, called me in right away and said, "In order to get a degree in geology here, you must take our geology field camp." And I said, "That's great, and I can't wait. That's why I'm here." And he said, "Well, we don't allow girls on the field camp." And he said, "You'll have to find someplace else to take it." And I was like, "Oh, well, that's a chore, and then, you know, how do you pay for it if I can't take it on my regular schedule?" I also had a national defense loan to help me through college. And so I thought, oh, well, you know, something will happen, I'll manage. Well, fortunately for me, at the end of that year before I took field camp, he went on a sabbatical. And the rest of the faculty voted that they wanted to allow women to come in and into field camp. So I got to go. Now, to be fair, I don't think that they were all that dedicated to gender equality. They knew I could cook, and they needed a camp cook. So I was able to earn my way through field camp by cooking over an open fire on the top of the White River Plateau for our field camp. And it was great fun. I loved it. The camp cook had a lot of privileges that the rest of them didn't have, like I got to go to town every week. And so that turned out really well. When I was at Colorado State University, this was so long ago that we went down to Boulder, to the CU campus, to hear a very outrageous new theory in geology called continental drift. And we got down there and we got so excited and inspired by this wild concept, continental drift, with, you know, continents slamming into each other, and nobody had ever heard of such a thing. So that's how ancient I am. That was a whole new theory at the time. Don't want to leave out some of these. There was a marked difference between me and a lot of the guys in our department. I always wondered how they ended up with summer jobs with Texaco or Chevron or some other Shell Oil or something like that. And I figured, well, they must have family, you know, in the business that's getting him this job. And my dad, being a shrimper, certainly didn't have those kind of contacts. The big advantage I had with my father being a shrimper was when I was in marine geology, or marine biology, I'd go out on his shrimp boat with him with my little bottles of formaldehyde, and he'd sweep in the net, and I'd just start grabbing squiggly things and putting them in formaldehyde, and I came in with the greatest selection of invertebrates that anybody in our class ever had, including what was called a ctenophore. And it's a jellyfish that has neon flashes all over it. But my biology professors were pretty excited about that. But that didn't get me any summer jobs. I was always waiting tables or babysitting or working on tele-dialing or, you know, with people, that annoying thing that everybody's trying to sell you something. Anything I could do. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that these guys were going to interviews with companies. No one even told me there was a company representative on campus. But they were going to interviews and getting these summer jobs and getting jobs after school. But because I was a girl, people just assumed I would never go to work and never be hired, and no one even mentioned it to me. So I finished my degree. I was the first woman to graduate in geology from Colorado State. And I thought, well, what do I do now? No job, no husband, nothing. And so I thought, well, I'll go to graduate school, and I'll probably end up teaching sometime. So I applied at the University of Texas at Austin and went there to graduate school and had a marvelous experience there. My first month or so there, one of the professors took me aside and he said, you know, Robbie, if you want a job in geology, you can probably get one if you major in micropaleontology. That there are some women that work in the lab in micropaleontology. And I loved paleontology, but I didn't like micropaleontology. And I love stratigraphy and sedimentation and all kinds of things. But I thought, well, you know, maybe I don't need to worry about that. Maybe I will just get married and have kids. And so why should I gear myself to something I didn't think would be any fun? So I just ignored him and went on and took the classes that I thought I would like and kept going with my degree. And sure enough, by the time I got my master's degree, I was married and I had a little baby girl and needed to follow my husband to his job. And so I did that, and I did that for a couple of years. And then I realized, you know, knowing yourself is a big part of getting your career right. I realized pretty soon that I just wasn't cut out to be June Cleaver. I didn't like being at home all the time. I'd been working since I was a freshman in high school, and I missed it. I missed being out there in the world. And I missed geology. And so at one point I told my husband, I think I'll try to get a job, and I'll take my salary and hire a maid to do all these things I don't like doing in the house. And he said, well, if we have a maid, I don't need a wife. Well, he said that about 3 times. I'm sure he was joking. But it took me about 3 times to hear it and go, I don't like this. For other reasons than that, we ended up separating, and I went off to find a job. I took my daughter, who's about 2.5 years old. We went to Houston, and I was able immediately to get a tech job with a geophysical company. Now, to tell you, to also date you, we were doing calculations on magnetics and gravity using these old calculators where we would type in the numbers and then hand crank it to give us the addition and subtraction and division to calculate gravity data. Then we would punch cards and put it into a computer that was the size of the ladies' bathroom in here. And so things have, you know, come a long way since those days. But I was looking for a full-time job while working at this tech job. Now there's another point in my life where good fortune came my way. That was 1973, and affirmative action had come into place with the Equal Opportunity Act with Lyndon Johnson. And suddenly, all the major oil companies in the world, or in the US anyway, had to hire women and blacks and Hispanics and disabled and veterans. So suddenly there was a great demand for us. And that was a very fortunate time for me, because here I wanted a job, and these companies were being forced to hire people that ordinarily they were turning down. So that was good fortune. I got a job. Not only got a job, I really wanted to go back to Colorado. I love Colorado. The rocks are all exposed there. It's good fun as a geologist. And I got a job with Texaco in Denver, and picked up my baby and everything else and moved to Denver. Denver was a wonderful office to work in. My boss was under no illusions about why he had to hire me. And he immediately nicknamed me Token. And so when we would have staff meetings, he would call down the hall, "Hey, Token, we're having a meeting. Time for you to come in here," you know. And I'd trundle down to the office, and he called me Token for all 4 years that I worked with him. Fortunately for me, of course, in those days, there wasn't this thing about harassment, but that there is now. So he could get away with it, and for me, it was also, I knew he was kidding and just trying to lighten the situation. And I, being the daughter of a shrimper, I think, I came into the world with a born sense of humor. So I just laughed with him when he would do things like this. And at one point, he called in everybody because we were going to have a review of all the disabilities in the staff. And he had a whole list of disabilities, you know, and it ranged from serious ones like epilepsy or something to nearsightedness. And he had to go through the staff and say, okay, does anybody have this disability? Does anyone have that? And that way we could fill our quotas with the government for all of these disabilities. So when he finished the list, he said, is there any disability here that anybody has here that hasn't been on this list? Well, women were not allowed to go out on wells at that time. Well sitting was only for the guys. And so I raised my hand and I said, yeah, I think I have a physical disability. And he said, well, what's that, Token? And I said, well, I apparently don't have the genitalia I need to do well site work. Oh, he couldn't wait to put that down. He sent it up to division and said, you know, we have a major problem with the women over here in this division. So we did eventually get sent out on wells, to the great relief of all of our colleagues on the staff, because the guys were having to do all the well site work, and that meant their rotations came up quicker because 2 women were not doing any well site work. And so they were very much relieved when we started doing our fair share, so it worked out just fine. Another time my boss let me hire a young man to go out and do some field work on a project I was doing. And we like to hire young men in the summer, as you know. And so I had this young guy come in, and I showed him the project that I had in mind. It was to go to the San Juan Basin and collect samples all around the rim to bring back in and look for better reservoirs. And I showed him the places to go, and I gave him a company car, an expense account, and sent him on his way into the field, and he was going to do this work for 3 months in the summer. And after a week or so, he came back in and he said, I'm going to have to quit. And I said, why? And he said, well, I got married and my wife doesn't want me gone all summer. I said, you know, that's the trouble. We hire you young guys and you just get married and quit. And of course, I'd get fired for that nowadays, but in those days, we weren't at that level of pickiness yet. So he did quit, and I didn't get my field work done that summer. It went for another year. Another time, my boss, who I said called me token, he was wonderful. I mean, he mentored me, he tutored me, he gave me raises, he gave me challenging jobs. He introduced me to so much geology. I was very frightened of going to work in the oil business because at the University of Texas at Austin, I had heard from many, many professors that geologists who went to work in industry were just giving up science, and they were not true academics, and that they were really selling out. And so I love geology, and I was worried about a career in the oil business, thinking, am I going to regret doing this? Am I going to be stuck just, you know, drilling wells and not learning anything new? And the minute I got there, I found that, you know, several times a year, you have a new project where you are doing research and you're learning everything new and creating whole new ideas about an area. It's like doing a master's thesis 2 or 3 times a year. I mean, it's great, and you're learning all the time. And in industry, they are pushing the edge of our science all the time. Our technology, the science, new ideas, you are successful when you are the most creative thinker on your staff. So the whole rumor about selling out in the science because you went to work in industry just fell by the wayside, because it just isn't true. You're just dragged along like a big ocean wave in science when you work in industry, and it's fantastic. And of course the technology today is so different than it was then. And we have so many more things to work with. When I was first in the industry, it was when deltas were discovered. And every delta on the Gulf Coast was being mapped. And then they would take this model of current sedimentation and they would apply it to every sandstone they saw in the world. You know, it would just be pressed into the delta model. And that was a long time ago. And it took years before then that whole idea was tossed away and everything became a valley fill. And then we had systems tracks. But that evolution of ideas and thinking that I've gone through in 40 years has been nothing but exciting. One of the areas that my good boss put me into was structural plays in the Rocky Mountain region. I wasn't a structural geologist at all. I was a sedimentologist, paleontologist. And he said, no, I want you to work on these mountain fronts. So the Rocky Mountains have all these mountain ranges out in the foreland of the thrust belt. And so I started working on them, and at that time we were in a big controversy between people. We have some A&Mers here. Dave Stearns, who was with Texas A&M, had this big theory going on all of these mountain ranges being controlled by vertical uplift. And that was in disagreement with Bob Berg's theories of compressional tectonics. Well, my boss put me on that project, and I started looking at these mountain fronts and trying to determine, you know, how many of them were actually compressional, were thrust faults, and how many of them were not, and what evidence we had for them. And I got a lot of seismic in my hands to look at that, and I did a lot of research on the drilling that had been done, and then I was able to give talks about this and publish it, and you know, that was about the most exciting thing I did in structural geology, and learned so much. It was like, as I said, doing a PhD on structural geology. So that was one of our great projects that I kept working on long after I left Texaco. At one point, my boss brought me in and he said, you know, the demographics of companies is going to change drastically because we have now entered a big oil boom. This is the late 70s and early 80s. And he said, have you noticed how many of these guys have quit and taken jobs with little independence? And I said, yeah, you know, half of our staff. And he said, well, And he was preparing me because he was actually about to quit and take a job with an independent. And he said, you're going to find that these independents don't have to hire women because they're not bound by affirmative action where the majors are. So eventually the majors are going to be nothing but 100% women, and the independents are going to be 100% men. It's going to be a big change. I'm like, wow, that's going to be interesting. Maybe I could be president of Texaco. But within like 2 weeks, I got a call out of the blue from an independent little oil company saying, will you come to work, come interview for a job with us? Now these were really exciting times, because when you went to work for an independent in those days, in the early 80s, you got like double the salary, you got a company car, you got an expense account, and most of them got a petroleum club membership. So this was really high living. And so I interviewed for this job and took the job that was offered to me and quit Texaco. And all the other women that worked for Texaco did the same thing. So we immediately dispelled that theory. And my job with the independent was absolutely the best training in the whole wide world for ever becoming an independent myself, because I was very involved in all of our geophysical programs, the engineering, the land acquisitions, deal making, showing prospects, getting partners. And that kind of teamwork and working with people outside your company is one of the things that led me to have the skills to have my own company and do my own prospecting. But it was a great experience. My boss, of course, was promising petroleum club memberships to all of his new hires at this little company. But the petroleum clubs were not allowing women at that time. So he went to battle for me and the geophysicist, woman geophysicist he hired. He said, by golly, I told you you could belong and you're going to belong. And after a little bit of a fight there, he got us admitted to the Denver Petroleum Club. And this was long before Houston or Dallas or Corpus Christi or any of the petroleum clubs let women be members. The first time we went to go into the men's dining room, the maitre d' said, I'm sorry, you can't come in this room, it's men only. And we said, oh no, they've changed the rules. And he's like, they didn't tell me, and we stand there and he makes calls and he finally lets us into the dining room. And I told Louise, who was with me, I said it reminded me of a joke I had just seen in the paper. There were two women seated in a fancy dining room, and the waiter says to the ladies, I'm sorry, but we only serve men in this room. And one of the women said, well, good, bring us two. That's how I felt about the petroleum clubs. Just bring them on. I had let's see, don't want to forget anything here. Had a great career with that company, and then continuing on in the boom times, I got offers to start up a consulting business and offers for clients. Part of the reason that people would call me was that I was very active in the local professional societies, the Rocky Mountain Association of Geologists, the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. And so when you're in your spare time doing your volunteer work and getting to know people around the industry, they take note really strongly of your work ethic and your ability to get things done and your leadership abilities and your teamwork abilities. And so when I started doing consulting and working on my own, people would call me and ask me if I want to do a job for them. Or if I was trying to sell a prospect or get partners on a deal, I had a whole list of people that I knew in every company in town. So I just start down the list. And when you make a cold call like that, if you know them, hi Lou, this is Robbie Gries. Oh yeah, I know. They'll take your call. But if I've never heard of you, you know, they won't take your call half the time or more than half the time. So one of these things you learn in your career slowly is, and I think now we teach it, but at the time I was in school, we weren't taught the value of networking and doing volunteer work and getting your face out there and getting to know some people. I mean, that will make or break your career no matter what field you go in. And so I was always able to stay working even when the next downturn came. I stayed working for most of it. Towards the end of that downturn in my consulting, I went through selling a prospect 3 times, and before they gave me a check, their management pulled it and said, no, we can't take that deal. We're cutting everything out. I did some consulting on a water case, legal case, and my team lost the case, and I didn't get paid. I did some work sitting wells in Wyoming, and the company skipped out of town and didn't pay me. And I was beginning to get pretty desperate at this time. I mortgaged my house, which had almost been paid off, and sold some other property and just did whatever I could to stay alive for a while. And then I thought, well, I gotta take on a new challenge here in my career, because consulting is drying up and selling deals is drying up. So I took some classes in mergers and acquisitions, and I got real excited about, okay, maybe I can do this, because I know a lot of people that are trying to sell their companies and so on. Well, I ended up putting together a merger of 2 companies. We had to go out and raise public money, so I flew all over the United States making presentations to brokerage firms, and we raised about $12 million to put this, which isn't a lot, but it's a lot for me, to put this deal together, and we created this new public company. My partners in this deal, after we merged, I was running the Denver office, and I found that my partners weren't sticking with our business plan, and they weren't being real honest with our bankers, and they weren't being real honest with me. So once again, I thought, okay, I can't do this, so I quit, and that's when I started my own company, Priority Oil and Gas, and did it kind of on a wing and a prayer. And I had been fortunate to have an opportunity to buy some old gas wells out in Kansas. Now, this was another dogma. When I was first in Texaco and Reserve Oil, all the engineers said that one well will drain 640 acres of gas. And the geologists would always fight with the engineers and say, no, I know it's better than that, you know, our economics will be better if you'll let me put two wells or 4 wells or something in there, you know, it'll be a much better prospect. No, the dogma was 1 gas well drains 1 square miles. That's the engineering way. Well, I had this opportunity to buy these 3 shut-in gas wells in 3 different areas in northwest Kansas, and I knew it could be developed, and I knew there was room for infill drilling. So I bought them very cheaply, and through all these contacts, I got financial backing to go out and do a 3D seismic on these 3 little areas, and that reduced my risk. Usually our dry hole ratio out there was about 80%. You drill 10 wells and have 8 dry holes. But with the new fad of 3D seismic, which it was not new in the Gulf Coast at that time, but they were not using it in the Rocky Mountains that much. But now, of course, we don't do anything anywhere without it. But at that time, I took it out and got the financing through some relationships I developed for doing some 3D programs, and then we infill drilled all these wells. Again, knocking out the old dogma of 1 well drains 640 acres, and we'll have like 10 wells in one section draining that reservoir. So that was really good and successful for me, and allowed me to finally breathe easier. Now I can do exploration with, a constant check coming in from our gas development. And that also allowed me to do more with my volunteer work. And AAPG was a long-time bastion of good old boys running the organization, very few women not doing much in the organization. Well, one of the presidents of AAPG, a man named Jack Parker, he looked around at his 30 committee chairmen, all men, and people on those committees, 99% men, and he said, this is not the dark ages. I want to see some women on these committees now. And this was in the early 80s. And so at that point, me and other women were being invited to do work on these committees, volunteer work. We did that. We did it well. And within 15 years, although women were only about 10 or 15% of the membership, we were chairing 25, 30% of the committees. That's hard work. It gets you there. And fortunately for me, at one point, I was asked to run for office with AAPG. I ran for secretary and won that and served on the executive committee. And then a few years later, was asked to run for president of AAPG. Now this, as you mentioned, Roger, was just Vern, was one of the biggest highlights of my life or my career, and it is for anybody who gets an opportunity to be president of this organization with 40,000 members worldwide. And I was elected president, the first woman president, and this was at a time, another fortunate thing for me, that AAPG had decided to really expand their emphasis worldwide. And so coming in as president that year, I decided to visit every one of the regions where we had geologists. And I put together tours in South America, Middle East, went to Saudi Arabia, had to go across the bridge from Bahrain, with an escort. Went all over Indonesia, South Pacific, all over Europe, Eastern Europe, and I went to 40 countries that year, and it was all over Africa. It was the most exciting thing a geologist can do, because everywhere you go, even if you're there only 2 or 3 days, they will take you out and show you some geology. So it's always fun. And I gave talks to like 60 societies. I gave talks to a lot of universities, 70 universities, and made friends all over the world. So that had to have been, the highlight of my career. I know it's a highlight of the careers of a lot of friends of mine who've been president of AAPG. And all of it started right here at Del Mar. Del Mar, as a junior college, at that time, every professor I had, whether it was English, government, history, biology, geology, every classroom was like 20 or 30 students. We didn't have a TA coming in teaching us. We had Professor Griffiths, we had Professor so-and-so. Almost every professor that I had, every teacher I had was a PhD. I had the best education, 2-year education, that I think I could have gotten anywhere. UT Austin would never have provided me with the depth of education that I got here in every subject. Geology was great. And that's the other thing. Del Mar introduced me to geology, and it's made my world wonderful. But I can say to you guys that are going to community colleges and junior colleges, you're not missing a thing from a 4-year college by getting a sound education in those first 2 years at a school like this. And I really appreciate having come to Del Mar. So thank you.